There have been 30 shootings in the past 14 months in Manchester, and now one of Salford's former mayoral candidates has been assassinated on his doorstep. Paul, Mr. Big Massey, said in a 1998 interview that he knew he could be killed at any time, but he'd pity the man that did it. The erstwhile politician had been part of the Gangland scene in the Manchester area, and some claim the father of five was murdered for mediating between two warring gangs. Peter Walsh, former Manchester Evening News journalist and author of Gang War, the inside story of the Manchester gangs, joins us now via Skype from Preston in Lancashire. Peter, welcome to Going Underground. So Paul Massey, 55, 4 gunshot wounds, died in what the police called a targeted killing. Who was this former mayoral candidate, Mr. Big?
Well, he was an unusual nominee for a Mr. Big, really. He didn't look the part. He wasn't the typical sort of smart-suited, suntanned, gold Rolex-wearing mobster. He was a rather modest-looking character who dressed down in jeans and T-shirts, cropped hair, pale, and you wouldn't have really picked him out in a crowd on the terraces at Old Trafford or Main Road. But he commanded enormous loyalty among his troops and became probably the key figure in Manchester's underworld.
And even before his bid for the mayoralty, I understand he was involved for a time with class war. What's class war?
Well, during the late 80s, there were a number of street disturbances in Salford. And again, Massey's name cropped up a lot. Indeed, that's the first time that he was publicly named by one councillor as the alleged Mr. Big of the area. And they were kind of involved in street politics, and sort of left-wing groups like Class War had a certain amount of popularity in these areas where people felt that they'd been disenfranchised. The local community was missing out, really, on what they saw as something of a bonanza. So I think you'd define his personal politics as a kind of almost like a sort of rough and ready street social work. He wanted greater opportunities for local youths. He was, interestingly, opposed to the sale of certain hard drugs, most notably heroin, which he refused to have in his area of Salford. And at one time, leaflets were sent out through the area saying, "Don't deal smack or you'll get a crack," which was indicative of the sort of methods that he would use to discourage others from intruding on his patch.
Heroin an increasing problem because of increased production because of the Afghanistan war now, and in later life was he also trying to keep heroin off the streets?
Certainly, I think he was genuine in that regard. I mean, the group that he was associated with from Salford, the criminal elements, were quite well known for their involvement in the sale of what you might call club drugs, things like ecstasy and amphetamine. But he certainly, I think, had a genuine antipathy towards heroin, which he thought ruined people's lives. And there was one famous story that a close friend of his had become a heroin addict, and he actually essentially kidnapped him and held him as a prisoner for 4 or 5 days until the guy had gone cold turkey and kicked his habit. And that was his attitude. But certainly as he got older, it proved harder and harder to do that because there were new, very dangerous young gangs in the area who did see the opportunity for making money out of heroin, and that brought him into conflict on a couple of occasions with them.
How bad is the gangland situation? I know that Massey was being monitored by parts of MI5. Presumably there is a law enforcement presence there, and yet shootings on a scale of 30 in the past 14 months.
Yeah, it seems to go in cycles in Manchester and possibly the same in other cities. It first developed a serious gang problem, gun-related gang problem, in the late 1980s when a large number of illegal weapons first started to hit the streets. And it was notorious in the early 90s when the city became known as Gunchester. Largely at that time, it was involved conflicts between predominantly black gangs in the Moss Side and Cheetham Hill areas of the city, and then latterly spread to other areas. But as I say, these things do tend to be cyclical, often dependent on one or two individuals. When those individuals go to prison, maybe things quieten down. And certainly Manchester, for the last 5 or 6 years, has not had the problems that it had in the past. It had, to an extent, I think, live down that previous bad reputation. But it only takes, again, one or two individuals, one or two feuds, an incident that sparks something, and the whole thing can start up again.
You think any sign of retribution for the killing of Paul Massey ahead of us?
Although he maintained and would have maintained through the years a lot of his criminal associates, and although his friends were very loyal to him as he was to them, it would be a stretch, I think, to immediately go from there to saying that there will be retribution. First of all, you would have to ascertain, or they would have to ascertain, who it was who was behind this. And at the moment, I'm not sure that there is any clear theory of who it actually was. Secondly, there's going to be an enormous amount of police attention. This is the highest profile murder in the city for a long time. And I would imagine there will be scores of detectives working on this case. Again, that may hamper the movements and activities of anybody who might be looking for some sort of reprisal. But it may also be that, Paul Massey was 55. A lot of his friends are of a similar age. It may also be that there's no longer the will there to carry out the sort of revenge that maybe once they would have done.
And the police said very quickly that it was a targeted killing, but it wasn't related to recent shootings that there's been in that area.
Certainly it has the hallmarks of, for want of a better word, a professional hit, doesn't it? The gunman sort of appearing from nowhere, who obviously were aware of Mr. Massey's movements. I don't think a gunman would have just hung around outside his house on the off chance that he was going to turn up. They seem to have known that he was going to be there. The killing itself was carried out with deadly ferocity. And then the gunman quickly disappeared. So it seems the indications are that it was a targeted and deliberate killing, but that may make it all the more difficult to solve, because the kind of people or groups that are capable of that are often also very capable of hiding their involvement.
Was he mediating between gangs at the time?
I don't believe he was, no. It had been suggested that he might have been. There has been conflict between at least two groups in the city in the last couple of years, but I've heard no evidence to suggest that he was. And I would have thought also, had he been, it wouldn't have been such that it would have led to his death. But it's very difficult to say. At the moment, I'm not sure there's any strong theory as to who did this or why.
Arguably, Massey's politics in the 80s class war wasn't so successful. He did fail in the mayoral bid. What about progressive politics in Lancashire? Do you see a resurgence of the kinds of perspectives that Paul Massey had?
I see a resurgence in disillusionment, maybe, and when people are disillusioned with mainstream politics, they tend, don't they, to look outside the mainstream to more fringe groups. His campaign wasn't ultimately successful, but it's interesting, he did achieve around 2,000 votes, which, for a man with a string of serious criminal convictions, and that is what he had, that's quite remarkable, really. You would have thought that he would have been outright rejected by the community, but he had a kind of brand recognition, I suppose. He was infamous, if not famous, in the area. A lot of people would have known him and his extended family and friends, and as I say, he did command great loyalty and could give it in return. So it wasn't a bad return, actually, in terms of an election. I think he got twice the votes of the Greens, who are an established political party. So surprising, really, but that was the kind of clout that he carried.
Peter Walsh, thank you.